I'm really happy to introduce Bob Pollin, who I've known for many years. We both remembered, although we don't remember exactly the right same people speaking. Last time I introduced him was at a plenary after the stock market crash in 1987, which dates us both. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst who's done work in a number of fields having to do with economic justice, including the living wage, the initiative to raise wages even above the minimum wage in urban areas so that people can afford to live in the city limits. He's done a lot of work on environmental sustainability, infrastructural investment, and green investment as a strategy for economic growth, and of course, full employment policies, monetary policy, rethinking the Fed and how the Fed functions. He has served on, I'm going to still say this, Senator Bernie Sanders' committee on Fed reform, among other international initiatives, work on the minimum wage in Florida, I just learned. So I'm happy to welcome Bob Pollin to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I have to say I'm really impressed. You have 12 events just in this semester on economic justice. Well, I mean, economic justice deserves that kind of attention. It doesn't usually get it. Speaking of details, how do I move the... Yeah. Oh, here we go. Does this work? Oh. Okay, so the topic, economic logic and moral imperative of full employment. This is, we can discuss it, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss it, but I would say this is maybe the most fundamental economic justice question that we confront from the perspective of economics, economic policy. It's a question that's exactly at the intersection of what, as we were talking about at dinner, technical economics. There are hard technical questions that we face in addressing the question of full employment, but there's also equally massive normative questions. What kind of a society do we want to live in? How do we construct such a society? And that's all about employment. So I'm going to start by asking some really simple questions, and you probably already have the answers, but I think they're worth thinking about just for a minute anyway. So why do we put so much stress on the issue of employment? Why do we care so much about whether people have jobs or not? Okay, I know you know the answer, but like I said, it's worth thinking about it anyway. The simplest reason is that employment is the basis for determining people's living standards, almost everybody's living standards. There are very few people that are able to live off of inheritances. Some get to live off of government support. But for the most people, not only in the United States, but everywhere, your employment situation determines your standard of living. Your standard of living and the people in your family or the people in your household that you support. Okay, so that's the most important reason. That's why it's so fundamental. There's other reasons as well, and now we get a little bit into. By the way, do you need me to stay close to this mic for any reason, or I can wander? Okay, I may wander then. Okay, so start wandering. Okay, secondly, getting into some of the more economics is, yes, we want people to have jobs so that they have income, so that they can live, but it also follows that when you have a job, then you have money to spend. And when you have money to spend, that supports business activity in an economy. Business activity, in turn, is what encourages businesses to invest, to expand, to innovate, to adopt new technology, and it's the basis on which businesses, in turn, will want to hire workers. So, employment is fundamental for establishing livelihoods. It's also fundamental in terms of establishing a viable economic environment. Okay. And then related to that, again, extremely simple point, but it's worth saying, people that have jobs pay taxes. And when people pay taxes, that supports the state. That supports things like this institution that we're in right now. It supports the public sector. And when people lose their jobs, that means that tax revenues go down, and that means that there's less money available to support things like public education, where you all are enjoying the benefits, and I myself have been teaching in public education for 32 years. So that's why we care about employment. Correspondingly, why is unemployment such a big deal? Why is unemployment such a massive social pathology? Yeah, I list out some reasons. Again, the most obvious, if you're unemployed, the thing that gets you employed means that you have a livelihood. When you're unemployed, your livelihood is diminished, threatened, could be altogether ruined. Corresponding to that, when you don't have a livelihood, you don't have security. You don't have financial security, you'd also lose your psychological security. That in turn affects your health. It affects your ability to function in your family. It affects your ability to participate in your community. All of those things. And people's sense of self-worth is diminished through the experience of unemployment. Here's a quote from a historian that I think captures very well the phenomenon of being unemployed. Donald Sassoon. The unemployed are preoccupied with the needless worry of making ends meet, by the anger of being unwanted, unemployable, unacceptable, by the frustration of having become a human surplus which cannot be absorbed. Here's a graph plotting the co-movements of the unemployment rate in the United States and the suicide rate in the United States from 1999 to 2010. And I know you all are sophisticated with statistics. We know that correlation doesn't mean causation necessarily, so I'm not going to claim that we are necessarily seeing causation here, but I think I could tell a fairly good causal story explaining this tight relationship between the movements of the suicide rate and the unemployment rate in the United States. You could say, oh, what is the story? Well, I already told you the story. That's the story. The story is the unemployed are preoccupied with a needless worry of making ends meet. It affects your security, your financial security, your psychological security, your ability to participate in your community, and so forth. Okay. Now, further. Now, I know this. So this is a seminar on social justice and rights. It's not just about economics. So the very notion of equal legal rights. We're not talking about social rights necessarily. More narrowly, equal legal rights. We construct a society that is founded on the notion of equal legal rights. Well, how do we give that notion substantive meaning? How does it become meaningful? Well, it isn't meaningful if people aren't given the capacity to participate in the functioning of their own community. If, to get back to the quote from Donald Sassoon, if people are consumed with the fact that they are unemployed, which they are consumed because it affects their financial well-being, their social well-being, their family's well-being, you cannot expect people to function fully in a society, and that therefore it's not reasonable to think that a society that cannot deliver full employment is a society that is committed to equal rights. It can be committed to equal rights in a formal sense, But in a substantive sense, it is not committed to it is not committed to equal rights, because you cannot exercise your rights if you are consumed with the overarching problem of being unemployed. Now, I've talked about full employment as if we really know what it means, and I will get into some more details for now, but the most important thing I want to state for now in terms of what it really means. You also can't think about the notion of full employment unless people are actually getting paid decently. So full employment has to denote a society in which there is an abundance of job opportunities for people, and those job opportunities afford people at least something akin to what we could call a living wage. We can get into what we mean by living wage, but I want to give you a counterexample here. What I'm calling here Bolivian full employment has nothing to do, I have nothing against the country of Bolivia per se, but this is a story that has actually happened to me, is a true story. In the mid-1990s, I was part of a team of economists that was asked by the United Nations to go down to Bolivia that had just suffered a very severe bout of hyperinflation and depression, which brought on massive cuts in government spending. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. You'll see why in a second. Okay, so I go down there, and you know these teams. We're in a very poor country, Bolivia, that has a massive experiencing of depression. Nevertheless, we're staying in a fancy hotel. We're the gringos in a fancy hotel. And my job was to address the issues of reducing unemployment. And I was assigned to work in the Ministry of Planning, which was in the building next door to my fancy hotel. And between the fancy hotel and the Ministry of Planning, there were probably about 15 limousines lined up with chauffeurs standing outside. And but I walked. That was a real commitment. I walked to the next door, and in walking from my fancy hotel to the Ministry of Planning, with all the beautiful gardens and chauffeured limos, I'd say there were 75 people that were sitting on the street begging or selling bubble gum or batteries or transistor radios or pens. Anyway, you get the picture. So I go up to the offices of the Ministry of Planning to meet my colleagues, the economists in the ministry, and I was sent there to talk about reducing unemployment. So I walk in and I say, okay, I'm here, let's talk about reducing unemployment. And these were PhD economists from good US universities. They said, we don't have any problem. There is no unemployment. Really, that's what they said. They said, there is no unemployment. I said, okay, well, let's do that. Let's do an experiment. Let's just do an experiment. It's a very high-tech experiment. Let's look out the window. Come on. Let's look out the window. Now, you see those people? I saw them because I just walked from my hotel over here. There's 75 people just between your building and the hotel that are begging on the street. And you're saying there is no problem of unemployment. And they said, that's right. They said, because they are employed. They are gainfully employed. They are doing work to try to make money. And by that definition, you know what? They were right. If that's your definition of employment and you have no standard whatsoever as to the quality of employment, they were right. So that's why I call it Bolivian full employment. It is easy to get to full employment if that's your standard. Right? Government doesn't have to spend a penny you can be in the worst depression ever. In fact, the worse the conditions, the faster you'll get to full employment, because people won't be waiting around trying to get to a job. They certainly won't have time to be filling out survey forms from the government saying, are you employed or are you not employed? Because they're going to be too busy begging in the street or doing anything to scratch out a living. That's not full employment in the way I mean it, okay? That's not decent employment, and it does not correspond to any notion of human rights. So, when we talk about a full employment economy as I mean it, we're talking about an economy in which, yes, there is an abundance of employment opportunities, and they are at least decent jobs. Not begging in the street. Okay, now, the notion of full employment was the moral centerpiece as well as the analytic centerpiece of economic policy in the United States and throughout the advanced world, and really most of the world, after the Great Depression, after the 1930s depression. Why? Simple. Because the world had just experienced what it's like to live under mass unemployment. And the 1930s was a period in which unemployment in the United States rose to about 25% of the workforce. Worse in parts of Western Europe over time, at certain times. The mass unemployment led to all kinds of extreme changes in political configurations, including the rise of Nazism and fascism. How did Adolf Hitler get elected in 1933? He promised to end mass unemployment and actually did a pretty good job at first. So, out of the 1930s depression emerged the commitment that governments should be focused on controlling the problem of unemployment, on mitigating mass unemployment, on eliminating mass unemployment, and developing a full employment society. Again, you know, if you think about it in a simple way that I started, why shouldn't governments be committed to full employment? It's good for individuals, it's good for families, it's good for businesses because people have money in their pockets to spend, which enhances business opportunities. It generates tax revenues, which means you can have a better, more vibrant public sector. You can have a more vibrant private sector, a more vibrant public sector, and individual. I'm not saying that all problems are solved, but family life at least benefits from the stability of having income and employment. So, coming out of the Great Depression in World War II, the fundamental project, sometimes under the name Keynesian economics, was mobilized to construct societies committed to full employment. And the first, they had three basic tools. The first was macroeconomic policy, and I know some of you don't do economics. I won't get into the details unless you ask. But that's basically two tools of manipulating the levels of government spending. When employment is weak, government spends more to stimulate job creation. Interest rate policy, when employment conditions are weak, the government lowers the interest rate in order to encourage businesses to borrow more, to invest more. Okay? That's macroeconomic policy in two sentences. Protections for workers. So again, part of the idea was indeed that jobs shouldn't be lousy jobs, that there is some basic standard of decency in employment that has to correspond to the notion of full employment. The idea of minimum wages, the first minimum wage laws in the United States were passed in the 1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, a leading politician at the time said, any business that is unable to afford to pay its workers a living wage has no right to operate in this country. Guess who the politician was? Nobody wants to guess? I know you know. I can tell. Huh? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. Okay. So, and then the third and critical feature was the regulation of the financial markets. Because it was evident, there are different theories as to what caused the Depression, and the Depression, of course, led to the mass unemployment. But one of the things that was evident was the excessive speculation in financial markets, which led to the 1929 Wall Street crash, contributed massively to the onset of the Great Depression and mass unemployment. So stabilization of financial markets was critical to the commitment to unemployment, to controlling unemployment. Now, did it work? Did macroeconomic policies, financial regulatory policies, social protection for workers, did they succeed in maintaining something akin to a full employment society? Okay, so here's some data. You had to know I was going to start tossing in data. Okay, so these show you the unemployment, the median unemployment rates for the OECD countries from 1950 to the most recent full year, 2013. So the OECD countries are basically US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, now South Korea's in it, Mexico's in it, but basically you get the idea. It's a rich country club, for the most part. Okay, now what happens? World War II ends, we get demobilization. Now look at this is the median, so some countries are above, some countries are below, but this is the median. 1950 to 59, full decade. The official unemployment rate, the median, is 2.1%. That is effectively full employment. You always are going to have some people that are between jobs. That's called frictional unemployment. Okay. So that's going to be 1 or 2.5%. So when you see 2%, you're at effectively full employment. Okay. So we have this full decade. Now what happens in the 60s, 60 to 64? 2.2%. 65 to 69, 1.8%. 70 to 74, 2.2%. Okay? Now, yeah, things start changing big time. 5%, 7.5%, 6.2%, 8.2%, 8. We will talk about that in a minute. But let's just, for now, pause and look at this period. This is not a trivial period of time. This is 1950 to 1974. That's 25 years, 19 countries. Could they achieve full employment? Yes, they did. We had a period, 25 years after World War II, after the construction of a full employment policy agenda, in which government policy was explicitly targeted at maintaining something like, and you know, of course there were debates exactly how committed you are, what the exact policy mix should be. Some countries did it better than others, some governments were more committed than others. But here are the results. We ran a full employment, rich country club for 25 years. And then it stops. And it stops. You see that it stops. Now, what about during the period when we had it? Here's an observation from Arthur Okun, who was the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson in the late 1960s. So this is not like a left-wing out there figure. This is a very, very mainstream economic, an economist of the time. Here's what he's saying about the full employment experience. Full employment has been the key to the reduction in the number of people below the statistical poverty line from 40 million in 1960
to 25 million in 1968. It has meant jobs for those formerly at the back of the hiring line. It has made economic security a reality to millions of middle-income families. This is what full employment is supposed to achieve and did achieve. Okay? Poverty down from 40 million to 25 million. Okay? 15 million people moved out of poverty because you had a society in which there was an abundance of job opportunities. And they had to have been decent enough job opportunities such that people had a wage that got them out of poverty. It meant jobs for those formerly at the back of the hiring line. So, right, there is competition in the labor market. There's competition, but the question is, with full employment, you can move further into the hiring line and give opportunities to other people, to an abundance of people. That's what full employment is in theory, and that's what full employment was in practice. Now, we saw the figures. The full employment era stops. It stops in the mid-1970s, and we have not gotten back there since. Regardless of what the rhetoric is at any given time, we haven't gotten there. Now, why? Well, what we had was a massive policy transition. A policy transition away from, you could call it Keynesianism. We don't have to call it Keynesianism. You could call it social democracy. Labels don't really matter much to me, but I'll throw one out now. To a new era of what is now called neoliberalism. What's neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is a different variant of capitalism. Note that the full employment period was full employment under capitalism. These were all capitalist countries. Yes, at the time there were also socialist countries that called themselves socialist, but we're talking about capitalist countries that achieved full employment on balance for 25 years. That was a society in which we mixed, obviously, the interests of business and the commitment to full employment as a feature of how the society should work. That commitment gets eliminated starting in the mid-1970s, moving forward to the present, and is supplanted by neoliberalism, which, as I said, is an aggressively pro-business variant. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, full employment is no longer the policy centerpiece. Instead, we have the notion that full employment creates serious problems of inflation, and that we need to control inflation first and foremost. And if we can get to full employment and control inflation, maybe at the same time, well, okay, but we have to be really focused on inflation control as our first target. Secondly, we have a different notion of how you get to full employment in the first place. The new notion of what creates unemployment in society is the notion that anyone who wants a job can get a job as long as they're willing to pay and willing to accept a wage that a business is willing to pay. Right? We don't have to think of it as this big macroeconomic problem. Let's think of it as an issue of individual bargaining. A business is going to offer a worker a job and a wage that the business thinks they can make money. Yes, they're going to pay the worker, and the worker is going to accept the job, and it's going to be worth it for the business at the same time. Otherwise, there's no point in making the bargain. Okay, so in that situation, we should be at full employment as long as workers are willing to accept a wage at which the business decides they're worth it. Then how do you get to unemployment in such a society? I mean, why should there be any unemployment as long as you think of this as an individual bargaining situation? Well, according to Milton Friedman, I don't know, how many of you heard of Milton Friedman? So Milton Friedman, it's fair to say, was the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. The most influential, the first half of the 20th century was John Maynard Keynes, so the originator of Keynesian economics. Now, Friedman thought up this term, the natural rate of unemployment. Here's what he meant. Think about this individual bargaining situation. There should be no unemployment or voluntary unemployment. Voluntary meaning, I don't want to take the job at the wage you're offering me. It's not good enough. Well, that's your decision, but that's all you're worth. In that kind of situation, you are choosing voluntarily to be unemployed. Now, how could you get a society with mass unemployment in this situation? Well, according to Friedman, it's the very social protections that were built in to the previous era, that cause unemployment. The simplest example you can think of is the minimum wage. Okay, so what happens in the minimum wage? I'm an employer. I want to hire you to work at McDonald's. I think you're worth $7 an hour and you're not worth a penny more. I'll offer you $7 an hour. The government says I have to pay you $8 an hour because that's the minimum wage. Well, I'm not going to hire you at $8 an hour because you're not worth $8 an hour. In that situation, according to Milton Friedman, the cause of unemployment is the government policy. The government policy of the minimum wage, which inhibits workers and businesses from reaching a bargain. You can spread that argument out more broadly. Any kind of social protection that gives workers the ability to withhold their labor is going to cause unemployment. Unemployment insurance is another major example. Why? Okay, you get laid off. How badly do you need to go get your next job? If there's no unemployment insurance, you're desperate, and you'll get another job, such as the people in Bolivia. They'll do anything, because they have to. They have no choice. Unemployment insurance gives you some opportunity to seek out a job that maybe is a good job for you, and you can stay out of the labor market and be unemployed. Well, according to Milton Friedman, that's the very cause of unemployment. Okay. Now, another feature of the neoliberal model was the notion that the financial markets are way overregulated. These people know what they're doing. They're the smartest people out there. Why are we, the government, telling them what to do? So rather than taking the lessons of the 1930s and saying we need to keep a cap on excessive financial market speculation, on the laws of the casino consuming the operations of the productive economy, let's let the financial markets do what they want. Again, they're really smart people. You know, they have all these fancy models, and we shouldn't be telling them what to do. Neoliberalism. So under neoliberalism, as we saw, we have this long-term trend, and of course there's a lot of details that I'm not covering. But basically, we move from a world which is essentially delivering full employment to a world that is no longer delivering full employment. It isn't even close. So, what happens in the neoliberal era? Well, we know about the financial crash 2007 to 9 and the subsequent Great Recession. I'll give you some data on that. But the point I want to start with on this is that, as you see with the unemployment data, the Great Recession was no aberration. What we've experienced consistently throughout the neoliberal era is persistent financial crises, bailouts, government bailouts of the financial sector, deepening financial instability, and worsening employment conditions. That has been the pattern. So, for example, this shows you the relationship between the average wage for non-supervisory workers in the United States from 1960 to 2007, and I'm deliberately cutting it before. This is not the crisis. This is before the crisis. Okay? So it cuts in 2007. So this is the real wage, and this is productivity. So what do we see? We see that the real wage is going up. This is in 2007 dollars. Is going up steadily from 1960 to 1972, and this is an index of productivity. But you can see the productivity is going up, but actually the real wage is going up faster than productivity. So productivity tells you how fast the pie, the overall economic pie, is growing, and when the real wage is going up faster than productivity, that tells you that workers are getting a bigger share of the economy's overall income. But that stops in 1972, and we see what's happened. There have been some ups and downs, but basically what we see is overall, if we compare 2007 with 1972, workers made more money in 1972 than they did in 2007, despite the fact that productivity was going up the whole time. Now, if you have productivity going up steadily, more or less steadily, and wages actually going down, that means the pie is getting bigger, but the share of the pie going to workers is getting smaller. That's inequality. Want to understand inequality in the United States? Start with this picture. That's what's happened. That's been a feature of neoliberalism prior to the crisis. Now, what happens with the Great Recession? Now we're looking at unemployment rates. And first, let's look at this lower pattern. So we have had other peaks. Now, this is the period, this is the period before during the Keynes, so-called Keynesian era, where we have a much lower average rate of unemployment. Unemployment starts, now there are periods of ups and downs. Unemployment peaks at around 10% in 1982. This is under President Ronald Reagan. It comes down. We do have this brief period of low unemployment in the late 1990s, but then here we are going back up again, and here we are in the Great Recession. We're back at close to 10% unemployment in the worst period. Now, what does 10% unemployment mean? Think about the labor force in the United States is about 157 million people, so that means we're looking at about 15 million people. Okay? So what is 15 million people? If you think of the population of New York City, population of New York City is about 8.5 million. Okay, then let's think about the next biggest city. Think about Los Angeles. That's about 3.5 million people. So that gets us to about 12. Then think about Chicago. That's about 2.5 million. Then think about the next biggest city. That's Houston. That's about a 1.75. 15 million people. Now think about every single person in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. Think about every single person, man, woman, child, senior, baby. Think of them all as being unemployed. So that's a 10% unemployment rate in this economy. Now, this second line, which is higher, shows us something else, which is another official rate, unemployment rate, from the U.S. Labor Department, which is the broader measure of unemployment. That is, it takes account not just the people, do you have a job, do you not have a job, but if you are looking for a full-time job and you end up with a part-time job. If you dropped out of the labor force because you're discouraged, you can't get a job, so you don't look for 3 weeks. This is the broader measure, and this is, again, an official measure, and this one peaks at close to 17%. So that during the recession, that is about 25 million people. So I already said New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, now add in Philadelphia, add in Phoenix, add in Dallas, add in San Antonio and San Jose, the 10 biggest cities in the world. That's all in the United States. That's 25 million. Okay. So that was showing you the period from the 2009, the peak of the recession, but where are we now today? Things are actually a lot better than they were in the peak of the Great Recession, or I should say the trough of the Great Recession. These are the statistics for today. And I literally mean today because I looked them up on the train coming in. Okay, so the official unemployment rate as the most recent, the narrow measure is 5.8%. That's a lot better than 10%. Still 9.1 million people. The broader measure is 11.5%. That's 18.1 million people. That's today. And remember, we're at the end of 2014, and the recession officially ended in 2009. So we're 5 full years into an economic recovery. So we have done better. Now, the percentage of people participating in the labor market, in 2008 was 66% of the working age population, and it's 62.8% today. The difference between 66% and 62.8 is 5 million people. So people, we were talking about this at dinner too, some people may have left the labor market because they're aging, or they decide to take early retirement. But if we say roughly, most of these people would not have dropped out entirely of the labor market, you can tack on 5 million people to these numbers, which would be about 3 percentage points of unemployment. So that would be about 8.8%, and that would be 14.5%. That's where we are today, 5 years after the end of the recession. And what about wages? Because again, when we talk about a decent full employment economy, we have to talk about wage standards. And the fact is that wages have been entirely, the average wage has not budged at all since the end of the recession. Has not gone up at all. And that's for the average, and for the lower 90% of wage earners, wages have actually gone down. Okay, so finally, can we think about reconstructing a full employment, sustainable full employment economy now? And my answer is yes, we certainly can think about it. We're doing it right now. But how do we actually get there? First of all, the first thing we have to do is actually say that it matters. And we have sessions like this, and thank you very much for organizing it, and think about it and say that this is a national goal. As it happens, on the train coming down here, I was on the phone with an old friend who is not in this world at all. And he said, so what do you, I said, I'm on the train, I'm going to talk at the college in New Jersey. And he said, so what are you talking about? I said, the economic logic and moral imperative of full employment. He said, he calls me Robert. A lot of friends call me Bob. This guy's 85 years old, you gotta remember. He calls me Robert. He says, Robert, that's the most important question in the whole society. I said, David, I couldn't agree with you more. I wish more people agreed. He said, you're right, well, good luck with it, So anyway, we have to take it seriously. And so that the notion that you can't use government policy to stimulate job creation, which was the idea that got embedded in the neoliberal framework, has to be overturned. Now, if we're going to pursue so-called austerity policies that we have pursued, which says we can't afford big public sectors. We have to lay off teachers. We have to lay off healthcare workers. We have to lay off police, fire, even military, which was in the New York Times yesterday or today. Well, you can make that argument, but keep in mind that state and local employment, to focus on one thing, and what state and local governments basically do three things. They do education, they do healthcare, they do public safety and amenities. Those are the three big things. If you cut the budgets, then you're going to have fewer jobs. It's very straightforward. So you can't get to a full employment economy through austerity. It's not going to happen. So you need full employment advocates. And therefore, you need people to stand up for the rights of workers. And that means you need to see these unions need to be fully integrated again into economic decision-making in the economy. And we have the tools. We have the macroeconomic policy tools. We have the regulatory tools. We just have to use them. And we have to use them in behalf of full employment. A second way to think about it is to think about shifting investment priorities in the economy. And that is, we want to shift towards things that meet important social goals, but also meet employment goals. Are there such things? And I want to tell you about two critical areas. One is investing in the green economy. Investing in stabilizing the environment through building up renewable energy and high efficiency buildings, high efficiency transportation systems. That's one. And then the second one is expanding education. Because education is a major positive source of employment. So let me just show you a little picture. What this shows us is job creation through spending. You spend $1 billion in the U.S. economy on these various things. How many jobs do you get? So I want to focus on comparing these two. Fossil fuels and clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. Fossil fuels, for every $1 billion of spending, you get 5,300 jobs. Clean energy, you get 17,100 jobs. Roughly, we're talking about 3 to 1 employment creation through building a green economy. So when you hear, for example, Mitch McConnell, after last Tuesday's election, say, first thing we're going to do is we're going to build the Keystone Pipeline because that's good for jobs. And all this green stuff is bad for jobs. It's actually the opposite of the truth. The truth is, when you build a green economy, you will create more jobs, not fewer jobs. Now, here are two big areas of public spending: military spending and education. Military spending creates 11,600 jobs per $1 billion of expenditure. By contrast, education generates 27,400. Again, 2.5 times more jobs per dollar of it. These are not small differences. These are not rounding errors. These are not 5, 10, 20%. We're talking about 3 times the number of jobs per dollar of expenditure by investing in a green economy versus a fossil fuel economy, by investing in education versus the military. So let me just do a simple exercise. What if we shifted 25% of all the spending we now have in fossil fuels and the military and shifted that 25% into clean energy and social spending? What would you get? You would create 3 million more jobs just by doing those things. And that would be the difference of about a 2 percentage point reduction in the unemployment rate. Okay, so finally, when we talk about building a new full employment agenda, I'm talking about combining things in the short run that can be done right away and that can have an impact right away. So for example, preventing cuts in education spending. Expanding education. Not having to keep defending the very notion of public education as a viable form of spending. Public education is the foundation of society. It is also a good source of job creation. Same thing with clean energy. We can invest in, let's think about maybe this building. You can retrofit this building, my guess would be, and save about 30% on energy costs in doing so. So you can do that right now. You can expand public transportation right now. And that would be more efficient and generate fewer emissions than keep building big cars and selling them. And then in the long run, again, a focus on investing in a green economy and education is the way through which you can stabilize the climate and you can expand opportunities for people to participate meaningfully in the economy. So that's the program. That's what I think we need to do, and that's how we can sustain a full employment economy in the U.S. in the short term and in the long term. Okay, thank you. Questions, comments, deep thoughts, denunciations, any of the above? Yes.
Since we were operating at a essentially full employment, why was there the shift towards
Great. Okay, so why was there a shift towards neoliberalism? A few, the immediate explanation would be, okay, in the 1970s, we had a different economy. Inflation started to rise significantly. And the argument was inflation was rising significantly because workers had too much bargaining power. As we saw, wages were rising faster than productivity. I guess I lose this thing. Well, anyway, you saw the picture. So, that means it's true. The pie, was getting bigger, but workers were getting a bigger share of the pie. And businesses didn't like it. Was that the cause of the the rise in inflation in the 70s? No, it was not. The main cause by far was the oil price increase in 1973-74, which was a 300% increase, and a subsequent second 300% increase in 1979. And the impact of those two increases as they spread throughout the economy. So, but the inflation was created in a situation, a kind of emergency, a crisis mode, in which it was, the argument was that we simply can't keep doing what we have been doing with respect to the full employment commitment. So that's one argument. The second one is that businesses did feel, in general, that workers had more power. They didn't want workers to have that much bargaining power. They wanted bargaining power to shift back in favor of business. The argument as to the centrality of this, of full employment as being a basis for raising worker bargaining power, actually goes back to this obscure 19th century economist named Karl Marx. And Marx called it the reserve army of labor. And he said that when the so-called reserve army of labor diminishes, workers do get more bargaining power and they will squeeze profits. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen. So I would say those were the two main reasons. There were other factors that were less important, but related to this was also the notion coming out of Wall Street that financial regulations had to be done away with. They didn't like them. They thought they could make more profits. And in fact, the inflation of the 1970s also did cut into profits of banks and other financial institutions because they actually weren't constructed around an inflationary economy. So for example, in the old days you could get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage at 6%, and it was fixed for 30 years. And that's, it's going to stay 6%. If the inflation rate goes up to say 8%, you're still paying 6% on your mortgage. That means the bank's losing 2% a year. So the banks were, and the financial markets more generally, started really becoming insistent on deregulation. And the deregulation kind of was officially crystallized in 1999. But the breakdown of the regulatory environment that came out of the 1930s started in this inflationary period of the 70s. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I recently read an article you had written called Transforming the Fed. And you talked about the social investment priorities. And the article was written in 1992, but I was wondering if you still held the same stance about how the Fed should play a bigger role in sort of allocating investment towards like social projects that would benefit the economy.
Yeah.
And I guess, how do you think the Fed today could play that role?
I actually think the Fed could play the role more easily than when I wrote the thing in 1992, just because conditions have changed so much. And then, as we talked about at dinner, the commercial banks are sitting on $2.6 trillion of reserve, cash reserves. We can debate as to how much they need as a safety cushion to prevent another liquidity crisis. But let's just say it's not $2 trillion. You've got to remember, $2 trillion, we're talking about 14% of the entire U.S. economy here. So the Fed could play an important role in creating incentives for the banks to start channeling credit, I would say, first of all, to small businesses. Small businesses do hire more people per dollar of expenditure than big businesses do. And small businesses, since the Great Recession, have been, significantly bereft of credit. If you just, on the aggregate, if you look at from 2009 to last year, in the aggregate, I'm not talking about every small business, in the aggregate, small businesses essentially have gotten no credit, zero. So that should be a major priority. Secondly, sectoral priorities, and financing the green economy has to be a major one. There's a lot of opportunities. If we're going to talk about a total transformation of our energy system, as we must if we take climate science seriously. I mean, either you, don't take it seriously. Say, it's just a bunch of nonsense. And it could be a bunch of nonsense. I'm just not willing to bet on it. So if you take it seriously, that means we need to be investing heavily in green economic activities. And the Fed could very significantly mobilize that by channeling credit in that direction. I will give you an example. I was at a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland in 2010 on exactly this question. It was called Green Recovery, the conference. And here, this is Cleveland, mind you, meaning, unemployment there was like 28, 29% at the time. And my suggestion at the conference was the Fed could start investing in simply retrofitting buildings and saving on energy over time quite significantly and creating a lot of construction jobs in the short run. They should give out, they're giving out 0% interest loans to the commercial banks. Give out 1% interest loans or 1.5% to small businesses to invest in retrofits. That's an example. So yes, I think that the thing I sketched out then in '92, and thank you for reading a very old article. Yeah, I think it's still valid. Yeah.
due to exemptions in the Clean Water Act, fracking's really had free rein to expand. I was wondering, since you've done a lot of work with green energy, what are you thought if there were maybe some regulations coming in the future was for fracking?
The future for fracking, again, if we don't take climate science seriously, the future for fracking is extremely rosy because, at least for the short term, the cost of generating electricity from natural gas through fracking is about 30–40% lower than it is for coal, or for that matter, wind, or for that matter, hydropower. So it's about 10 cents per kilowatt hour for coal, hydropower, wind. So hydropower and wind are basically at parity with coal, and fracking comes in at 6.5 cents. This is according to the U.S. Energy Department. So that looks great for fracking. The only problem is you cannot run an economy, you can't run an economy on natural gas any more than you can on coal or oil if you care about stabilizing the climate. And I'll give you it's true that natural gas burns cleaner than coal, a lot cleaner than coal, and modestly cleaner than oil. But let me give you an example of something, a little exercise I did. Let's say you eliminated coal entirely in our economy, and you replaced it 100% with natural gas. How would we do with respect to meeting the emission reduction standards set for the world of reducing emissions by 40% as of relative to today, by 40% within 20 years? How would we do? We would miss the target by about 50%. We'd be 50% too high. That's assuming we completely replace every single coal-fired utility plant with natural gas. It just doesn't get you far enough. So even if I love fracking, and even if I say, wow, the price is right, as there's a piece in the New York Times today about that it's great, it's really cheap. It's making energy costs lower for people. I'm not against that per se, but again, that doesn't seem to me to be the top priority with respect to the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has to contract massively, including natural gas, or else we will never, ever come close to hitting the emission reduction target. Yeah.
So does the U.S. need to maybe consider nuclear power? I know there's a lot of fear over the fact that there's been a lot of accidents in Japan. There was a near meltdown in Pennsylvania in the 70s, and since then our nuclear infrastructure is aging and crumbling. But if we were to invest in that again, because it is essentially zero emission, would that stimulate the economy and also?
Well, I myself think that the safety concerns about nuclear power, to me, are overwhelming. If you say, well, there's absolutely no choice, either you let the earth burn up or you build nuclear power plants, I would say, okay, well then maybe we have to think about the nuclear power plants. But my own research, I find that we could actually achieve the emission reduction targets, 40% emission reduction target within 20 years, by investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and running an economy at a overall energy consumption level that is about 30% lower than it is now. And within that economy, it's much more efficient that about 25% of all energy is supplied by renewables. The rest by a mix of fossil fuels and nuclear staying about where it is now. So that's my conclusion. I should tell you, I was in a seminar at UMass on Monday on exactly this question, and my colleague was staunchly defending the idea that the only way to hit the emission target is to just let nuclear completely take over the entire globe. Something like 40-fold increase in nuclear capacity. That's his view, and I don't agree.
Yeah. Would you say that in regards to fusion technology? instead of fission, which is usually the
Yes, I would. Look, right now, nuclear, if we think about the whole world economy, and we think about it in terms of energy units, BTUs, British thermal units, the whole world economy is run on about 500 quadrillion British thermal units. Of that, 25 is nuclear. So nuclear is about 5%. Now, if we're thinking in that range, okay, there are certainly safety issues, as we saw in Fukushima in 2011. I would say that's somewhere vaguely in the range of manageable risks. If we're going to do something like my colleague was talking about, basically running the entire global economy on nuclear is something significant. Increasing nuclear by 10-fold, 20-fold, whether it's fission or fusion. The risks that you aren't using proper safety, I mean, even in Japan, the safety regulations were there, implementation wasn't there. And this is in Japan. This is in the country that has suffered most as a result of nuclear power. So if even in Japan they did not have adequate safeguards, imagine if you increase nuclear power 10-fold, 20-fold, 40-fold, and it spread all over the world, and it spread into countries that don't have big budgets for regulatory control. I just think that we are really playing Russian roulette with public safety, no matter what tech. And again, if I said there was, okay, here's your choice. The Earth is going to burn up, or you're going to face these safety issues with nuclear. Which one do you choose? I don't know which one I would choose. The first thing I would say, is there a third alternative? And I actually think there is a reasonable third alternative, which is investing in efficiency and renewables.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Do you think that globalization had a large impact on decreasing the real wage in the United States?
Oh, absolutely. What do we mean when we say globalization? So that's part of the deregulatory regime. And if we want to think of it in the way that Karl Marx talked about the reserve army of labor, one way to think about globalization was a massive expansion in the reserve army of labor. And so to make it very specific, if you have workers in New Jersey building, say, auto parts, and they go to their employer and say, we want a raise, and the employer says, oh, that's nice, you want a raise. Well, I'll just move to Mexico. Or I'll just move to China. Do you still want that raise? Now, this is not like a made-up story. These are stories that have actually been told over and over and over and over again. And the critical point in the story is not whether or not the company actually moved, but that they could make a credible threat to move. And so that weakened the bargaining power of workers. And so that's why even when productivity is going up, workers didn't have the same bargaining power. And let me put it in even more stark terms. Sorry, I'm such a klutz with this thing. I don't even know how to get the kick. That's fine. No. We can imagine. But in 1997, 98, unemployment did briefly go down below 4%. The best performance since the 1960s. If we had the picture, I'd show you, but we can imagine. Okay. Now, for those of you that study your macro with an outstanding professor like Michelle Maples here, you know that when that happened, even there was no oil price shock, and guess what? There was no increase in inflationary pressure, even though we were at unemployment below 4%. Why did that happen? Well, here's what Alan Greenspan said, who was at the time the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And again, by no means any flaming lefty. He said, the workers in the United States are traumatized. That was his word, traumatized. Traumatized by what we just just mentioned by globalization. They are afraid that even though we're at low unemployment, that still doesn't mean that, you know, that when the workers go and ask for the raise, the owner says, oh, sure, I'll move to Mexico. Keep asking for that raise. I'll move to Mexico. So that was Greenspan's own analysis. And for that matter, if you like become fanatical about these things, you can read the Fed minutes at the time. Greenspan says this story about traumatized workers, but he wasn't the only one. There was a member of the Federal Reserve then who at the time was the most liberal member of the Fed, who said the same thing. That unemployment is low, but workers are afraid to bargain up wages. Who was that? Janet Yellen, who is now the chair of the Federal Reserve. So that's a huge part of the story. There are ways that you can counteract that, but we have not developed the institutional tools yet and the commitment to counteract it, but that's a very good point. So the last question, who's going to do it? Yeah.
Do you think there's a steady supply in skill sets for being able to develop these kinds of clean energy projects that you argue for trying to, well, you and I guess the Commerce Department argue for trying to invest in? I guess in terms of like a structural sense, the skill set of the employment.
Is there a skill shortage? Are you
Correct.
Maybe, but quite moderate. I've been in discussions with people a lot about that. People, they want to see more investment in vocational training for these things, and I'm all for it. Do I think that this is a major bottleneck? No, I do not. Yes, at the level of kind of investing in engineering, Pollin, there are obviously differences between being a nuclear engineer and a solar energy engineer. Are the skills transferable? Yes. Do we see evidence of skill shortages to a significant? I haven't seen them, but of course, the clean energy economy is also very small scale. And by the way, I don't think that bottlenecks are necessarily such a bad thing. When you hit a bottleneck, that gives you an indication of where you need to improve. It doesn't mean like everything just stops. Like, oh, we can never invest in, retrofitting buildings anymore because we've run out of people that know how to do it. It means, oh, okay, yes, now let's expand vocational training. And we were talking also at dinner about construction jobs not getting enough people moving into the area. Well, because it's such a volatile industry. Stabilize the industry, and you'll get more people moving into it. So I think it's a modest problem, but it's easily soluble.
Well, please join me in thanking our speaker.